Welcome to Revenge Oath. Tonight we are exploring a case where every jack-o'-lantern smile masked a lie, and Holmes soon realized the killer wasn't choosing victims at random. He was recreating a forgotten Halloween legend. Your comments mean the world. Tell me where you're watching from today. Now let's follow Holmes into the mystery. Sherlock Holmes' jack-o'-lantern case on an October evening so thick with vapor that the street lamps of Baker Street looked no more substantial than pallid moons adrift in a brown sea. A hansom cab halted before the familiar door and deposited a figure whose very haste seemed to carry the night in with him. Dr. Watson, absent that afternoon on his rounds in Kensington, returned at the same moment and, pausing upon the step to pay his jarvey, found himself jostled by a small, wiry gentleman whose bowler was beaded with mist and whose whiskers bristled as if electrically charged by agitation. Lestrade of Scotland Yard is not easily disturbed. He had once, in Watson's hearing, described a triple burglary and a stabbing as a busy Monday. Yet, as Mrs. Hudson ushered them both upstairs, his gloved hand trembled upon the banister, and his eye, sharp as a ferret's, twitched towards the sitting-room door, as though fearful that even the walls might overhear. Holmes, lounging with singular gracelessness upon the settee, one long limb hooked over the other, and a black clay between his fingers, raised his gaze from the violin lying open in its case upon the table. The coal fire was banked, the Persian slipper bulged with tobacco upon the mantel, and the atmosphere held that faint odour of chemical reagents which Watson, who had known it on summer mornings and winter dawns, associated with the peculiar serenity that always preceded his friend's most incisive efforts. "Ah, Lestrade," said Holmes without moving, except to regard the yarder with that quick, hawk-like contraction of the pupils which befuddled interest. "You smell of damp straw and tallow. Either you have dined cheaply in the stables of Covent Garden, or you have been summoned from a public house near the river where the candles are poor and the floors strewn. A night call, then. Pray for it. The case is urgent. Pray speak at once." Lestrade sank into the chair nearest the hearth. "It's not a pleasant business, Mr. Holmes. Not pleasant at all. If I may say so, it is one of the most—" He groped for the word and failed. "One of the oddest." Watson, who had laid aside his hat and stick, observed that the little detective's boots were filmed with a pale smear, as if he had passed through clay. A small burr clung to his trouser cuff, and a fleck of pale wax, tallow indeed, had insinuated itself into the nap of his sleeve. He produced a folded telegram from his pocket as though it stung his fingers, and thrust it at Holmes with a motion almost of relief. "We have a dead man in Chelsea," he said, "and a lantern." He swallowed. "Jack-o'-lantern, if you please." Holmes's nostril dilated. He stretched out his long arm and let the telegram unfold upon his knee. For a moment he did not read it. His eye had gone with that strange economy of movement that Watson had observed in him since their earliest acquaintance, not to the message, but to Lestrade's damp cuff and the burr upon it. "You have been in a small garden," he remarked. "A box hedge. The burr is from common hedge parsley. The soil sits light. The garden is raised above the road, for you stepped down when you left it, and the rain of this evening has not yet penetrated to the roots, or your boots would not be caked. There is the faintest odour of paraffin upon you. You stood close to a lamp that had been recently filled, and your sleeve brushed a wick. And tallow, candle stubs then, in addition to oil. Curious," Lestrade's mouth worked. "You make me feel like a specimen, Mr. Holmes. And I don't deny you have the rights of it. Chelsea Embankment, a villa in Sloane Street, back entrance onto a little strip of greensward with a hedge. The dead man is Sir Alistair Venneck, Baronet, lately returned, from 3 years' residence in Dublin, and a person of consequence in certain circles, political and otherwise. You may imagine the Yard is not keen to blunder in the dark with the newspapers and the season, and he gestured vaguely towards the window, where the fog, pressed by an east wind, rubbed at the panes with a sound like wet velvet. Well, there's this. We found on the drawing-room table a hollowed turnip with a candle burning in it, cut with 2 eyes and a grin. A lantern, as I say. A jack-o'-lantern, a turnip, said Holmes softly, as if tasting the word. Not a pumpkin. We are not in America, Mr. Holmes, snapped Lestrade with unintended asperity. Then, recollecting himself, he added more mildly, the maids called it a puck. They say Irish lads carve them at Hallowtide. I know nothing of it, but there it was, smoking like the devil on the mahogany, and the baronet, he hesitated. The baronet was on the floor beside it with his throat. He passed a hand once across his own collar and looked away. And not a blessed sign of entrance or exit. Watson felt the familiar tightening beneath the breastbone, which the conjunction of sudden death and social consequence always induced in him. He had seen men perish in Afghan ravines with less ceremony than was here implied. Yet there is something in a gentleman's drawing-room, with the pianoforte closed and the antimacassars prim upon the chairs, that makes violence appear doubly indecent. Holmes, who had now read the telegram and laid it aside, steepled his fingers. "You will oblige me with the order of discovery," he said. Who found him, at what hour, who had access, and what the servants observed before and after. Lestrade nodded, settling to his professional recitation like a clerk to a ledger. Sir Alistair dined alone at 7. The cook served him a steamed chop and a glass of claret. He dismissed the footman at 1:15. At 8:30, Mrs. Pritchard, the housekeeper, goes up to inquire whether he will require the carriage. She finds the drawing-room door slightly ajar. The room is dim, blinds down, lamps low, but the table is lit by this thing. A demon's face leering, she says, and she nearly swooned. Then she sees Sir Alistair on the carpet, in evening dress with... Lestrade's hand made that involuntary motion again. There is blood, but not so much as you'd think. Windows fast, French doors locked, no mark on the sills. The servants swear the chain was on the front door and the bolts set. No one called, unless so quiet that the maid at the area steps never heard. "And you?" asked Holmes. "I sent for Dr. Goodwin, who lives 2 doors down," said Lestrade. "He made it within 10 minutes, declared the man dead. An hour or so, perhaps less. Knife wound, clean and deep. We searched the place from attics to coal cellar, outside and in. No weapon, no footprints in the back garden, save the housemaid's from the morning when she shook the rugs. The soil is damp, but not enough to make a heel clean. And there's this, on the inside of the drawing-room window, high up on the sash, there's a smear. Tallow, as you say, candle grease just there, a hand's breadth from the catch, like a finger might have brushed carrying the light. But no finger marks in any other sense." "Tallow on the sash," murmured Holmes. "And an oil odour about the lantern, no doubt, for your sleeve has told me so, and the lantern itself. How cut?" Lestrade blinked. "How cut, sir?" Holmes waved a languid hand. Eyes round or triangular, nose straight or hooked, mouth grinning or slit. Any irregularity? Lestrade frowned, searching his recollection. The eyes were not the same. One was a circle, neat, the other a sort of star, rougher. The mouth was long, with 3 teeth cut along the top. Holmes's lids drooped. "And the wick fresh? Is the candle handmade or moulded? Moulded, I should say. White, common. The wick was burnt a little and smoking when we came, wind of the door perhaps. There were 2 other stubs on the mantel-shelf, as if they had been compared or trimmed. And, dash it, Mr. Holmes," he looked up with something like entreaty, Why should a gentleman be murdered by a roaring fire with such a child's toy leering over him? Why this pantomime? Watson could not but admit the question's force. In his experience, wickedness seldom dressed itself so that the plainest eye might recognize it. It went in a black coat at midday and paid its bills. The grotesque, when it appeared, was often a screen behind which the ordinary exerted itself undetected. Holmes rose abruptly. He tossed the cold pipe into the grate, where it clinked among the ash. His face, which had been in the shadow, came into the light with a quick pallor that Watson had learnt to associate not with fear, but with the acceleration of the mind. Because, he said, when the commonest means of entry are impossible, and the time does not admit of elaborate contrivance, a murderer is compelled to advertise an impossibility in order to disguise a very simple possibility. The grotesque is often a veil for the obvious. You will have a cab at the door in 2 minutes, Lestrade. We go to Chelsea at once. Lestrade sprang up, relieved to exchange the weight of words for the promise of movement. As he turned, something small slipped from his inner pocket and rang upon the table. Watson, reaching to restore it, found that his hand closed about a coin, a copper halfpenny, blackened, sticky at the edge with the same pale wax. He glanced at Holmes, who had seen it fall and seen Watson see it. "From the lantern's base," said Holmes simply. "Keep it in your pocketbook, Watson. You will find it again useful when the night grows very late." Mrs. Hudson's step sounded in the passage. The fog pressed its forehead more insistently against the window. Somewhere in the street a coster called his wares, but the sound was muffled to a watery susurrus. Watson caught up his overcoat. Holmes already had his Inverness slung about his shoulders, and his hat settled lightly upon his head, as if it had leapt there of its own accord. "One last question, Lestrade," Holmes added at the threshold. "Sir Alistair Venwick, politics aside, was he a man of order?" Order? Lestrade paused, baffled. Methodical, regular, a clock watcher. The sort of man who would number his shirts and keep his letters tied in bundles by month. Lestrade considered, very much so by all accounts. He dismissed 2 footmen in June for mislaying a cellar key and tracking soot on the stair runner. Holmes's eyes brightened. "Then if the house has been kept in order, we shall know immediately where the disorder begins. Come, gentlemen, there is mischief afoot in Chelsea that believes itself very merry. We shall see whether it laughs so loudly when the candle is properly snuffed." They descended. The door banged upon the fog. The cabman's whip cracked. The horse set his shoulders against the harness with a grunt that hung in the damp air like breath made visible. As the hansom swerved into the boiling darkness of the Marylebone Road, Watson, with the sticky coin warm against his palm, and the image of that leering vegetable face graven unwillingly upon his mind, felt the curious lift of spirit that never failed to attend him at such moments, half dread, half exultation, for the game was afoot, and his friend had already scented the first faint thread upon the wind. The hansom rattled southward through the damp murk of Marylebone, the gas lamps outside gleaming like dull coins through the fog. Holmes sat opposite me, his long frame bent forward slightly, his face illuminated by the intermittent flare of passing light. His eyes, cold and luminous, were half closed in thought, yet I knew, from the rhythmic tapping of his fingers on his knee, that his mind was in rapid motion. Lestrade, pressed against the window, muttered half to himself about politics, newspapers, and the devil's work that was this time of year. When we reached Sloane Street, the mist seemed to thicken, swallowing the outlines of the houses until only vague silhouettes remained. The cabman drew up before a handsome villa with iron railings and a narrow garden path that led to a porch glimmering with lamplight. 2 constables waited there, their tunics beaded with moisture, and one held a lantern whose yellow glow quivered weakly in the fog. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of extinguished candles and something faintly metallic. The drawing-room door stood open, guarded by a nervous maid who curtsied as we entered. Holmes gave her a brief nod, his gaze already sweeping the scene with the swift, consuming precision of a hawk marking its prey. The body of Sir Alistair Vennick lay near the hearth, his head turned sideways, one arm extended as though in surprise. The features were composed, save for the unnatural slack of the jaw and a faint smear of crimson along the collar. Beside him, upon the polished table, rested the turnip lantern, a grotesque effigy still faintly smoking from the wick within. Its grin seemed to leer mockingly into the room, as if some impish spirit had paused to gloat over its handiwork. Holmes bent low, his lantern casting narrow circles of light upon the carpet. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. The absence of splatter, only a clean wound. The murderer used a sharp, narrow blade and struck from behind while the victim was standing. Note, too, how the right hand is slightly raised. Sir Alistair turned at the instant of attack. Lestrade joined him with a grunt. "We've looked for the weapon everywhere. Not a trace." Holmes did not reply. He took up a poker from beside the hearth, inspected the soot near its end, then replaced it. His eyes darted to the window. "You mentioned a smear upon the sash?" "Here," said Lestrade, stepping aside. Holmes leaned close, holding the lantern. The faint line of grease shone pale against the glass. He drew from his pocket a magnifying lens and examined it with silent intensity. "It is indeed tallow," he said softly, "and there are the faintest ridges, partial impressions. A right thumb and forefinger, both small and smooth. A woman's hand, Lestrade, likely one accustomed to fine gloves." The inspector blinked. "A woman, but there's no sign, no visitor." Holmes ignored the protest. He crossed to the mantelpiece where the other candle stubs lay. Taking one between his fingers, he turned it delicately, cut unevenly, as if trimmed hastily with a penknife. "And this residue," he sniffed lightly, "is Irish peat wax, not London-made. Curious, considering Sir Alistair's recent return from Dublin." He straightened, his gaze flicking to a heap of correspondence upon the desk. "Watson, if you would assist me, look at these." "Letters?" I obeyed, scanning the pile. "Most are business documents," I said, "though here—" I paused, lifting an envelope still sealed. The handwriting was neat, but faintly tremulous. "Postmark, Belfast." Holmes extended his hand for it. He held the envelope before the firelight. Unopened, addressed in a feminine hand, likely recent. His eyes gleamed. "The baronet may have received it this very afternoon." Lestrade frowned. "We've no warrant to open it." "Quite so," Holmes said absently, already slipping it into his pocket. "And we shall let the warrant follow the fact." He turned toward the window again, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "There is something unnatural in this scene, too ordered, too deliberate. The murderer wished this room to appear sealed, yet has overlooked the smallest thing." He moved suddenly to the far corner, where the heavy curtains brushed the carpet. With a single motion, he drew them apart. A narrow French door stood behind, its bolts set, yet one pane, low, near the floor, was cracked at the edge. Holmes knelt, touching the frame. A minute trace of damp earth marked the sill, as though something had been pressed there and withdrawn. "Not an entry," he murmured, "but a tool. Perhaps the end of a walking stick, or the base of a lantern. Yes." He rose sharply, his expression animated. "Lestrade, we shall examine the garden. I wish to see where your boots found that burr." Outside, the air was colder still. The little garden lay dim beneath the glow of the constable's lamp, a narrow strip of grass bordered by box hedge and a single, gnarled yew. Holmes stooped, scanning the ground. Presently he knelt by the hedge. "Here is your burr, Lestrade," he said. "And here, a fragment of white wax pressed into the soil." The murderer carried the lantern out, perhaps to conceal the candlelight while leaving the premises. He rose slowly, his gaze drifting toward the distant lights beyond the fog. "You see, Watson, this is not a random killing. It is a message, a grotesque token left by someone who wished death to mock rather than conceal. The jack-o'-lantern is both a symbol and a signature." I looked at him in perplexity. "You think the act has ritual meaning?" "Not ritual revenge." He turned toward the house, his eyes gleaming through the mist. "And I believe, before the night is out, that grin carved in the turnip shall smile upon us again." Holmes lingered by the hedge for several minutes, motionless save for the faint curve of his fingers as they traced invisible patterns in the air, as if rearranging the facts before him into their proper order. The fog pressed low upon the garden, muting the faint clatter of distant carriages. I could see, even in that dimness, that his keen face had assumed that peculiar stillness which marked his deepest moments of deduction. Lestrade shifted impatiently beside me, his boots sinking into the damp soil. "Well," he muttered at last, "if there's mischief here, it's of a sort I can't see. A wax droplet and a cracked pane won't hang a murderer." Holmes turned abruptly, the hem of his cloak catching the lantern light. "No," he said quietly, "but they will lead us to one. Come, back inside. We've seen enough for the moment." We re-entered the drawing room, where the fire had burned low and the grotesque turnip still leered across the polished surface of the table. Holmes's eyes darted to it again, but instead of approaching, he walked straight to the writing desk. From a drawer, he withdrew a small, leather-bound notebook, its pages mottled with use. It had been hidden beneath a sheaf of unopened letters. He flipped through the entries rapidly, pausing midway. "Ah," he murmured. "Observe, Watson, the entry for October 29th, appointment S, nothing else. And 2 days before that, letter posted, answer awaited. The handwriting grows shaky here, as if written in haste. Yet the man prided himself on precision. Lestrade, you recall your words? A gentleman of order, even a small inconsistency in a record like this, should give us pause." Lestrade rubbed his chin. "S could be anyone, a secretary perhaps? Or," Holmes said, his gaze drifting to the Irish letter now half visible in his pocket, "someone whose name begins with a whisper, not a shout." He snapped the notebook shut. "You will do well, Lestrade, to learn what you can of Sir Alister's recent acquaintances in Dublin, particularly those with a grievance or a cause." The inspector grunted, scribbling in his pocketbook. "And you, Mr. Holmes, what do you make of the lantern itself?" Holmes glanced toward the grotesque face once more. "A message," he said, "but one that can only be read in its own tongue. To carve such a thing and place it beside a dying man is not the act of a brute, it is deliberate theatre. Irish, yes, born of the old Samhain tales where spirits were mocked with their own likeness. And Sir Alister had spent 3 years among men who do not forgive easily. We may be looking not at a London crime, but an Irish one transplanted across the sea." At this he stooped beside the corpse once more, his long fingers examining the cuff of the dead man's jacket. "Watson, your eyes, what do you see here?" I bent close. The faintest smudge of greenish black marred the edge of the linen. "Ink, perhaps?" I said. "Not ink," he replied, his voice quick with satisfaction. "Verdigris, the patina of copper." "There are coins missing from Sir Alistair's pocket, Lestrade," the inspector started. "Now you mention it, yes. His purse was open but not emptied. Odd thing to steal a few halfpennies and leave a gold watch." "Not odd at all," said Holmes softly. "A deliberate removal. The killer took only one or two, enough to carry a meaning." He turned away from the body then, his expression thoughtful, distant. "The coin you found, Watson, keep it close. I believe it forms part of a message left for us, a grim correspondence between victim and murderer." As he spoke, a faint sound interrupted us. The creak of a board overhead, subtle yet distinct. All eyes lifted. The constable at the door stiffened, and Lestrade drew a sharp breath. Holmes's head tilted slightly, listening. "The upper landing?" I whispered. Holmes nodded once. Someone who has not yet learned that ghosts should walk silently. In an instant he was across the room and up the staircase, his movement so swift and noiseless that it startled even the constables. Lestrade followed, cursing under his breath. I came last, my heart pounding. The stairwell was dim, the only light a flickering candle from below. At the top, the corridor stretched narrow and shadowed, lined with closed doors. Holmes raised his hand for silence, then pointed to one half ajar, the faintest draught moving the edge of a curtain within. He stepped forward, and with the lightest touch pushed the door open. The small bedroom beyond was empty, save for the window which stood wide to the night. The fog drifted in like a living thing. On the sill, resting delicately beside the latch, lay a second object, a turnip sliver, freshly cut, its edge still moist, and beside it a drop of candle wax. Holmes's face hardened, and for the first time that evening, a glint of triumph lit his eyes. "You see, Watson," he murmured, "our visitor lingers close. The jest is not yet finished, but it shall be before dawn." Holmes crossed the small room in 2 strides, his lantern beam gliding across the sill, the curtain, the carpet, each examined in that steady, deliberate rhythm of his which always gave the impression that his eyes recorded more than they revealed. He stooped, touched the sliver of turnip with a gloved fingertip, then brought it beneath the light. The pale flesh glistened faintly, its cut edge irregular. "A fresh pairing," he murmured. "Our intruder was here within minutes, perhaps even as we examined the garden. The blade used was short and narrow, the same likely employed upon the victim. Observe the moisture, the vegetable's sap has not yet dried." Lestrade peered over his shoulder, the fog curling about them through the open window. "Then he was here? Watching us?" Holmes gave no reply. Instead, he lifted his gaze toward the opposite wall, where a faint smudge marred the wallpaper, just above the level of the window frame. He raised his lantern higher. The stain glimmered darkly. "Watson," he said softly, "your medical eye, what does that appear to you?" I bent closer, noting the faint sheen of red-black residue. "Blood," I said, "but thinly spread, almost wiped." "Precisely," Holmes whispered, "and not from the wound we saw below. The murderer grazed himself escaping. See the fine thread of fabric caught in the splinter." "Here?" He plucked at a thread so minute I could scarcely see it, holding it against the light. "Wool, dark, coarse, and of Irish make. A worker's coat. The man is hurt, though lightly, and will be seeking a place to bind the wound before morning." Lestrade straightened, his face hard. "We'll have every chemist and surgery in Chelsea warned within the hour." "Do so," said Holmes absently, turning back to the sill. "Yet he may not go far. Guilt is a curious tether. It keeps a man circling the very ground he wishes to flee." He leaned out into the mist. The narrow garden stretched below, the hedge dark as ink. "There, Watson, note that slight indentation near the U. where the soil is pressed twice, close together. A man descended here, then paused to listen before stepping away. No great height, but enough to twist an ankle should he be careless. The constable who had accompanied us swore softly under his breath. I saw nothing when I patrolled that hedge not 10 minutes ago. Then he was there, Holmes said quietly. You were his signal to leave. He withdrew back into the room, shutting the window and drawing the latch firmly. For a moment, only the slow rasp of his breath and the muted hiss of the lantern filled the silence. Then he spoke again, calm but intent. The pattern clarifies. The killer knew Sir Alister's household, its movements, its blind spots. He entered by stealth earlier in the evening, perhaps as a tradesman or messenger, concealing himself until the house quieted. The weapon, small, portable, was ready. He struck swiftly, left his token, and retreated here, waiting long enough to gauge the commotion below before escaping into the fog. Lestrade frowned. But what of the lantern? Why such mockery? Holmes turned his keen profile toward him. Because this crime is not one of impulse, but of message. The lantern is both disguise and declaration, an emblem tied to Ireland, to vengeance cloaked in superstition. Sir Alister Venwick's dealings abroad were not purely social, Lestrade. I suspect political entanglements of a kind that leave wounds slower to heal than flesh. He took from his pocket the halfpenny he had recovered earlier and held it between his thumb and forefinger. The faint wax around its edge caught the light. He left us this as well. A coin, smeared with the same wax that burned within the lantern. In Irish folk custom, such coins were placed upon graves or left at the doors of those marked for retribution. A grim currency indeed. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the fog seeping under the window frame. Then you believe this was an act of revenge, a political killing disguised as something spectral? Disguised, yes, but not to deceive the police. Holmes's voice grew low. To unsettle the guilty conscience, to mock the man who feared no earthly court but trembled before superstition. Sir Alister may have believed himself safe in London, but an old sin has found him here. He replaced the coin in his pocket and strode for the door. Come, Watson, we shall examine the household once more before dawn. There is a servant who trembles too readily, and a housekeeper whose fear feels rehearsed. Somewhere among these walls lies the thread that binds our ghost to its master. We descended again to the hall, where the servants waited in uneasy silence. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pritchard, stared at our return, her eyes darting toward the staircase as though half expecting something dreadful to follow us down. Holmes's gaze fixed upon her instantly. You have been in this house, madam? He asked quietly. 15 years, sir, she stammered, since before Sir Alister went to Ireland. And in that time have you known any person, servant or otherwise, who bore him ill will? Her hands twisted together. None that I can think of, sir. Only... She hesitated. Only a letter, 2 nights ago. It frightened him, I think. He burned it at once, though he tried to seem calm. I saw the flame in the grate myself. Holmes's expression sharpened. Describe the envelope. She frowned in effort. Dark paper, sir? With a green seal shaped like a leaf, I thought. Holmes exchanged a swift glance with me. A shamrock, he murmured. Our phantom grows a name. He turned to Lestrade. Tomorrow you will inquire at the postal office for all letters received from Dublin within the week. Tonight, Watson and I shall remain here. I have reason to believe our visitor is not yet finished, and it would be unwise to let him play the final act without an audience. Outside, the fog pressed thicker still against the windows, and somewhere far off in the darkness, a faint echo of laughter, low, hollow and fleeting, seemed to drift through the night air. Holmes's eyes lifted at once. "You hear it, Watson?" The jack-o'-lantern grins again. The sound was faint, so faint indeed that I might have mistaken it for the shifting of air in the chimney or the far-off whistle of a steamer on the river. Yet Holmes's face had turned sharply toward the window, his every sense sharpened into that peculiar stillness that seemed to draw the entire room to a single, vibrating point. The servants froze. Even Lestrade, ever the practical man, hesitated with unease flickering behind his eyes. "It came from the garden," I whispered. Holmes nodded once. "And not carried by wind. A voice, human, young, male, and close. The laugh of one who believes himself unseen." He moved to the extinguished fire, took from the grate the poker, and held it by the cold end like a walking stick. "Watson, take the lamp. Lestrade, you and your men follow, but quietly. We shall see if our grinning friend enjoys company." We stepped out into the night again. The fog was thicker now, rolling like breath from the very earth, dimming the lamps into formless amber, smears. Our boots made no sound on the damp path. Somewhere beyond the hedge, faint and intermittent, came that same strange note, half laughter, half hiccup, rising and breaking in the mist like a child's mockery. Holmes moved with a peculiar stealth, pausing at intervals to listen. I followed close, my pulse quickening with each step. When we reached the far end of the garden, he motioned for the constable to douse his lantern. The darkness fell thick upon us, save for the faint glimmer from the house behind. "Remain still," Holmes murmured. "He's near." A moment passed, two, then a faint shuffle among the shrubs, followed by the gleam of a small light moving low to the ground. It was not steady but wavering, as though carried by an unsteady hand. The shape of a man emerged, hunched and narrow-shouldered, his face obscured by a flat cap pulled low. In one hand he held a turnip lantern, its grin identical to the one we had seen upon the table inside. Holmes's whisper came like a thread. "Now!" Lestrade and his men sprang forward. There was a cry, a flash of movement, the lantern dropping and rolling across the grass where its candles sputtered out. The intruder darted toward the hedge, but Holmes was already there, striking low with the poker. The man stumbled, falling hard. Within seconds the constables had seized him, dragging him upright into the wavering light. He was young, no more than 25, with sharp features and a thatch of auburn hair. His coat was coarse and worn at the elbows, and blood had soaked one sleeve where a makeshift bandage was tied above the wrist. Even through his exhaustion, his eyes burned with defiance. Holmes examined him closely. "Patrick Reen," he said, almost to himself. "Laird of Belfast. A dockhand dismissed last year after the Venwick affair, I believe. You've been a long way from home, my friend." The prisoner's jaw tightened. "I don't know the name." "Then it is remarkable," Holmes replied coldly, "that the turnip you carry bears the very emblem of that same affair, a crude copy of the one placed beside your victim's corpse." He gestured to the constable, who brought the lantern near. "And see, wax identical to that upon the halfpenny I hold. A singular coincidence, would you not say?" Patrick's gaze flickered toward the light, and then away, his hands clenching. For an instant I saw a tremor of fear beneath his defiance. Holmes pressed on, his tone almost gentle. "You came here to finish your work, but you tarried too long. The second lantern? Intended for whom? For yourself, perhaps, when you found the courage you wanted? No matter, your presence here is enough." Lestrade seized the man by the shoulder. "You'll answer that at the yard." But Holmes's hand shot out. "No, Lestrade, not yet!" His eyes never left the prisoner's face. "There is something more, something not of vengeance, but of duty. Tell me, Patrick, who sent?
You? The young man's lips parted, but no sound came. A struggle passed across his expression, pride, fear, and some deeper torment. Then he spat upon the ground. No one sent me. He earned it. Ask your fine Parliament men what Sir Alistair did in Dublin. Ask the mothers who... He stopped, his breath catching. Holmes's gaze softened almost imperceptibly. So it is as I thought, he murmured. A ghost raised not from superstition but from grief. Lestrade signalled his men, who bound the fellow's wrists. Holmes turned away, looking out toward the dim outlines of the river through the fog. A pawn, he said quietly. There is someone else behind this, someone who planned each detail, knowing precisely how it would appear. The second lantern was not for murder, but for fear, to haunt whoever shared Sir Alistair's secret. He faced me then, his eyes alight with that strange fire of realization. Watson, the real author of this masquerade, walks free still. And before this night is done, I intend to see his face by the same lantern light he thought to mock us with. The constables led Patrick Reen toward the waiting cab. As the wheels turned and the sound faded into the fog, Holmes stood unmoving beside the gate, his profile pale against the dim glow from the house. Then, almost to himself, he murmured, "The dead man feared a letter, burned it, and received another visitor who wore his vengeance like a mask. We must find that unseen hand, and soon, for if I'm not mistaken, the jack-o'-lantern will burn once more before morning." Holmes did not move until the sound of the cab wheels had entirely vanished into the fog. Only then did he turn back toward the darkened villa, his expression more animated than I had seen all evening. The dim light from the remaining lantern lent his features a spectral aspect, his cheekbones stark, his eyes glittering with that particular brightness which to me always heralded the tightening of the noose around a mystery's neck. "Watson," he said quietly, "we have captured the hand, but not the mind." Patrick Reen struck the blow, yes, but the brain that guided him still hides within these walls, or very near them. He began pacing slowly toward the house again, the gravel crunching beneath his steps. He spoke of grief, of vengeance, but the words were too fluent, too rehearsed. I believe our friend was not the originator of the plot, but the instrument, a tool chosen precisely for his fervour and simplicity. Lestrade, trudging behind us, gave a doubtful grunt. "You think there's another party in it, then? A mastermind?" "I think," said Holmes, "that there is a person who understood both Sir Alistair's guilt and Patrick Reen's bitterness and exploited them for a purpose beyond revenge. Come, the night has not finished speaking to us." We re-entered the villa. The servants had retreated to the kitchen, leaving the hall in uneasy quiet. Holmes
went straight to the drawing room, where the grotesque lantern still lay extinguished upon the table. He examined it once more, then carefully lifted it by the handle. "Observe," he murmured. "The carving is crude, yet deliberate. Each cut was made with a short-bladed knife, the same one that opened Sir Alistair's throat. The maker was no craftsman, but the tool was steady in hand. Rien could never have carved so cleanly with his wound. This lantern was made earlier, and by another." Lestrade frowned. "But if Rien didn't carve it, who did?" "Someone within the household, or someone close enough to have access to its hearth and candles." Holmes's eyes flicked upward toward the ceiling, as though seeing through the floors. "The servants' quarters, Watson. Let us see whether the fire there has been used tonight." We ascended once more. The narrow corridor was dim, the lamps nearly out, but from the far end of the servants' passage came a faint, acrid smell, the mingling of burnt tallow and scorched fibre. Holmes's nostrils flared as he quickened his pace. A small ante-room stood open, and on its table lay the remnants of a candle melted to its base. Beside it, a paring knife, its edge still smeared with pale residue. "Turnip," he said at once, touching it lightly. "The second carving. Our accomplice has been careless, or perhaps hurried." Lestrade leaned over the table, his eyes narrowing. "One of the maids, perhaps?" They were all together when we arrived. Holmes shook his head. "Not all. The younger one, the scullery maid. I noted her absence when we questioned the others. She alone did not meet our gaze. Fear, yes, but not the fear of discovery, rather that of divided loyalty." He lifted the candle stub to the light and turned it slowly between his fingers. "Look here, Watson." A small impression along the base, a signet mark, barely visible. He rubbed it with his sleeve, revealing a faint engraving of intertwined initials. A.V. Alistair Vennock himself. The housekeeper's words returned to us now. He burned a letter 2 nights ago, but he also received one more recently. The sender of that letter did not sign it, yet the seal, dark paper, green wax, suggests Irish correspondence. And this candle, bearing his own mark, has been moved from his private study. Someone within used it to fashion a symbol of his death. I stared at him. "You mean to say the accomplice is not a servant at all, but someone he trusted?" "Just so, someone with access to his personal effects and reason to despise his dealings abroad. The young woman, I suspect, is merely an intermediary, a messenger, perhaps even coerced, but behind her stands another figure, educated, calculating, and entirely without remorse." He straightened abruptly. "Come, Watson, we must find her before dawn. If I am right, she will not flee. Guilt that feeds on righteousness seldom does." As we descended again, a movement in the lower hall drew our attention. Mrs. Pritchard stood there, pale and trembling, her hand clutching the balustrade. "Mr. Holmes," she whispered, "there's someone outside the back door, a woman. She says she must see you." Holmes's expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened. "Alone?" "Yes, sir. She came from the lane. The constable would not let her pass, but she insisted she had news." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, remain near the stair in case our guest prefers flight to conversation." Then to Lestrade, "Tell your man to admit her." Moments later, the door opened, and a figure stepped, hesitantly, into the lamplight. She was young, barely past 20, dressed plainly, but her cloak was damp with fog and her face drawn tight with exhaustion. In her hands, she carried something wrapped in a shawl. Holmes regarded her steadily. "You are the messenger," he said quietly, "the bearer of Sir Alister's last letter." Her eyes filled at once, and she clutched the bundle closer. "I never meant for it to come to this, sir. I swear it. He told me it was only to frighten him, to make him confess." "Who told you?" Holmes asked, his voice a mere thread. The girl's lips trembled. "Mr. Daly, sir. Fergus Daly, Sir Alister's secretary when he was in Dublin." At that name, Holmes's gaze flickered briefly toward me, and I saw the steel behind his calm. "Fergus Daly," he repeated softly. "Then the jack-o'-lantern does not grin from Ireland. It grins from within this very city. Watson, the game changes. Our phantom has a face, and it is one I think I have seen before." Holmes stepped closer to the girl, his tone soft but charged with precision. "You will tell us everything, Miss—" "Ellen, sir. Ellen Murphy." Her voice quivered, though there was courage beneath the tremor. "I worked for Mr. Daly back in Dublin. He came to London 3 weeks ago, said he'd found me a place here in Sir Alister's household. I was to take the post quietly and deliver a message when he bade me. I didn't know what it meant, I swear I didn't." Holmes's eyes did not waver. "You were placed here as his instrument. The message you delivered, was it a letter?" Yes, sir. He gave it to me sealed and said it would do no harm if the man had a conscience. I left it on Sir Alister's desk after dinner 2 nights ago." "The envelope," murmured Holmes, half to himself. "Dark paper, green seal, the shamrock Mrs. Pritchard saw." The girl nodded, tears now streaking down her cheeks. "He came again tonight, Mr. Daly did. Not to the house, but outside in the lane. He said the time had come, that I was to light the lantern and place it on the table once the house was quiet. He said it would scare the truth out of Sir Alister. That I mustn't look inside the turnip, only carry it from the scullery when I heard a tap on the back window. But when I came down, the police were already here. I swear I never saw the master dead till after." Holmes listened without interruption, his gaze fixed not upon her, but upon the bundle in her arms. "And what have you brought me?" Ellen hesitated, then slowly unfolded the shawl. Inside lay another lantern, smaller, unlit, its surface damp from the night. Its carved face was different from the first, the mouth narrower, the eyes mere slits, as though its mockery had been replaced with a grimace. "I found it in the lane after you ran," she whispered. "He dropped it, I think." Holmes took it gently, turning it in his hands. "The same handiwork," he said softly, but hurried. "This one was meant for us, Watson, for those who interfered, the second act of his grotesque little theatre." Lestrade leaned forward. "You believe Daly killed the baronet, then?" Holmes shook his head. "Not directly. Daly is a man of cunning and conviction, but not of violence. He planned, he directed, but the hand that struck was Reen's, and Reen, poor fool, thought he avenged a martyr. Daly merely played the puppeteer. His object was not blood, but exposure." He set the lantern down upon the table, his eyes gleaming in the firelight. Sir Alister's dealings in Ireland were not merely political. He misused his office, betrayed confidences, and, if I am correct, condemned innocent men to imprisonment under the guise of patriot suppression. Daly sought confession, not murder. But when Reen acted too soon, the stage collapsed around them both. Ellen looked up suddenly. "Then he'll come back, sir. He'll come back for me. I know it." Holmes regarded her gravely. "Indeed he will. And we must be ready for that moment." He turned to Lestrade. "Have 2 men positioned at the lane's end, another by the garden wall. No noise, no lamps. Daly is a cautious man, but pride drives him more surely than fear. He will come to see what ruin his plot has wrought, and to retrieve whatever evidence he left behind." Lestrade hurried off to give the orders. Holmes, meanwhile, moved to the window overlooking the fog-shrouded street. His silhouette merged with the faint light outside, and for a time there was only the faint ticking of the mantel clock. "Holmes," I said quietly, "you speak of exposure. What proof do you have of Sir Alister's guilt?" He turned his head slightly. "In his study, among his private papers, there will be something, a ledger, perhaps, or letters of exchange, showing payments sent under false names, the kind of record a cautious scoundrel keeps when his memory will not suffice. Daly knew of it. He meant to compel its revelation with fear." He glanced toward Ellen, who sat trembling near the hearth. "Tell me, child, did Daly ever speak of a phrase or password? Something he used in his letters?" Ellen frowned, thinking. "Only once, sir. He said if I ever doubted him, I was to remember the words, 'The fire of Tara still burns.'" Holmes's face sharpened as though struck by light. "Ah, then the pattern completes itself. A patriotic code, Watson. Daly belonged to one of those brotherhoods sworn to avenge the wrongs of Ireland. The lanterns, the laughter, all symbols drawn from ancient rites of vengeance. But this man is no mad zealot. He plays his politics with the instruments of fear." At that instant, the faint crunch of gravel sounded outside, the slow, deliberate tread of a man walking up the lane. Holmes's head lifted, his voice fell to a whisper. "Watson, extinguish the lamp. The curtain, draw it halfway. Let him believe we sleep." We obeyed in silence, the room dimmed to embers, the fog pressing ghost-like at the panes. Then came the soft scrape of the latch at the back door, followed by a pause so deep I could hear my own heartbeat. Holmes moved a fraction, his hand slipping into his coat pocket where I knew his revolver lay. The door opened with the faintest creak. A tall shadow entered, stooping low beneath the lintel, a man in a dark overcoat, his features momentarily caught in the faint red glow of the fire. His face was lean, the eyes cold and restless. Holmes's whisper reached me, soft as breath, "Fergus Daly." And as the man advanced, unaware of the trap that had closed around him, Holmes straightened from the shadows, the poker gleaming in his hand like judgment made flesh. Holmes did not speak as the intruder took 2 steps into the room. The silence was such that the faint hiss of the dying embers seemed deafening. Daly's eyes flicked toward the table where the lantern lay, and in that single instant I saw recognition and fury flash across his lean face. His gloved hand moved toward his coat pocket, but before it could close upon whatever lay within, Holmes's voice cut through the stillness, calm, cold, and unmistakable. "I would not, Mr. Daly. The constables in the garden have orders to fire if they hear a struggle." Daly froze. For a moment he said nothing, his jaw tightening, his breath faintly visible in the cold air. Then, slowly, he straightened, his tone measured and bitterly controlled. "So it ends here, then. I should have known Reen's courage would fail him." Holmes stepped into the firelight, his sharp features illuminated, every line of intellect and resolve thrown into relief. "Courage had little to do with it," he replied. "You misjudged him as you misjudged all men whose anger is greater than their understanding. You gave him a weapon and a cause, but not the wit to see the snare you set for him." Daly's eyes burned with a mixture of pride and contempt. "He wanted justice. I gave him a way to take it." Holmes's tone grew colder. "You gave him murder and then meant to slip away beneath the cloak of his passion. But you were too clever by half. You forgot that true conviction requires no audience. You meant this to be a spectacle, to frighten a confession from a dying man. Instead, you have created your own gallows." The Irishman's mouth twisted into a grim smile. "And yet you forget yourself, Mr. Holmes. There are wrongs that English law does not punish. I have seen villages burned, families ruined, men hanged for words spoken in anger, while the gentleman who condemned them dined on silver. You call me a criminal, but I am the product of your empire's justice." Holmes did not flinch. "I call you what your acts define. Vengeance may spring from righteousness, but once it turns to manipulation and deceit, it becomes indistinguishable from the evil it opposes." He moved a pace nearer. "Sir Alistair was a corrupt man, of that I have little doubt, but he might have been made to answer through law or conscience. Instead, you chose performance, a jack-o'-lantern's grin to mock a corpse. Theatricality is ever the refuge of the guilty mind." For a moment, Daly's facade faltered. His hands, still gloved, trembled slightly. "You think I wished him dead, you fool. I only wanted him to speak, to admit what he'd done in Ireland. The lantern, the laughter, symbols he feared since boyhood. I meant to unnerve him, not to kill." "And yet," said Holmes quietly, "you carved 2 lanterns." He gestured toward the table where the smaller one rested. "One for your victim, one for the pursuers. You planned a chain of fear, each link forged from superstition and guilt, but fear, like fire, consumes both the wielder and the weapon. The Irishman's composure cracked at last. His voice rose with desperate intensity. He deserved it. He betrayed men braver than himself, sold them to the hangman. You cannot understand what it is to live with that knowledge, to see the name of a traitor honored while patriots rot in graves. Holmes's gaze softened, though his tone remained unyielding. I understand better than you can imagine. But there is no victory in destroying what you despise by imitation. The flame you lit has burned beyond your control, Mr. Daly. It has claimed the very man you used to strike with it. Daly's breath came fast, and for an instant I thought he might spring at Holmes, but the sound of boots in the passage checked him. Lestrade entered with 2 constables close behind. Holmes's voice dropped again to that chill formality which brooked no argument. Inspector, your man here is Fergus Daly of Dublin, late secretary to the deceased. You will find in his coat pocket, I believe, a sheaf of papers, copies of Sir Alister's private correspondence, altered to serve his scheme. The originals, no doubt, remain hidden in the study. He sought not merely revenge, but exposure, an act of theatre meant to crown him as avenger and martyr both. Lestrade stepped forward, his hand firm on Daly's shoulder. You'll answer for this in court, sir. The prisoner made no resistance. His face, drawn and hollow, seemed to have aged years in the span of
minutes. You'll find nothing that justice won't vindicate, he muttered. But tell your masters this, there'll be others after me. The fire of Tara still burns. Holmes's eyes flickered briefly at the phrase, but said nothing as the men led Daly away. When the door had closed and the echoes of their boots had faded, he stood for a long moment before the extinguished fire. The faint glow from the lantern on the table threw a thin smile across the carved face, one that seemed almost mocking in the silence. At last he spoke, so quietly I could scarcely hear him. Reen was the blade, Daly the hand, but the mind behind such tragedy is older than either. Pride, resentment, justice, how swiftly they intertwine, Watson. It is a wonder men can light candles at all without turning them to instruments of ruin. I said nothing. The fog pressed against the windows like a waiting shroud, and somewhere far off, a bell tolled the hour. Holmes turned away from the lantern and reached for his coat. Come, my dear fellow, he said softly. The case is over, and yet I confess I find little triumph in its close. There are no victors tonight, only the echo of laughter that mistook itself for righteousness. Holmes's melancholy lingered as we stepped once more into the London fog. The air had grown colder, dense with the faint scent of coal smoke and the river's breath. Lestrade's cab departed with its prisoner, wheels muffled in the mist, leaving only the echo of hooves retreating into the unseen. For a long while, Holmes said nothing. He drew his coat close about him and stood upon the pavement, staring back toward the darkened villa, as though listening to some sound inaudible to human ears. At last, he spoke in a tone of quiet certainty. It is not finished, Watson. I turned to him in surprise. Not finished? Daly is in custody, the motive established, and the method clear enough. He cut me off with a slight gesture. Clear enough for Lestrade, perhaps, but clarity built upon assumption is the first refuge of complacency. Tell me, does the light of truth ever shine so easily through the fog? I followed his gaze toward the shuttered windows of the Vennick house. A single glimmer still showed faintly from the upper floor, where Ellen Murphy waited under constable guard. Holmes's expression darkened. There is still a missing piece, he said softly. When a man conceives a performance such as Daly's, every element serves his intent, the letters, the lanterns, the laughter in the fog. But what of the coin? That halfpenny, wax-stained and planted with such care. Daly never mentioned it, and Ellen could not have known. No, Watson, there was a third mind in this affair, quieter, subtler, content to let others play their parts while he observed from the wings. "You mean another accomplice?" I asked. Holmes began to walk slowly along the pavement, his long strides unhurried, his face turned slightly
upward, as though reading invisible signs in the fog. Not an accomplice, but an opportunist. Someone who knew of Daly's designs and used them as a cloak. Sir Alistair's death may have served more than one purpose. He paused at the corner, where the faint gleam of the river showed between the houses. "Do you recall the housekeeper's words, that Sir Alistair received a letter, burned it, and seemed uneasy thereafter? Suppose that letter did not come from Daly at all?" I stared at him, startled. "Then you believe someone else sent it? Someone here in London?" Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed. Daly's letter was delivered by Ellen, but the earlier one, the one burned, arrived first. Its effect was immediate, for Sir Alistair's routine changed from that hour. He dined alone, dismissed his staff early, and refused callers. A man does not withdraw from society over a letter unless its author knows his deepest fault." He resumed walking, speaking half to himself. The lantern was but the symbol, the stage dressing, but the true weapon was fear, and someone else kindled it before Daly ever arrived. The realization began to dawn on me. Then the murderer was neither Reen nor Daly, but the writer of that first letter? Holmes stopped short, his hand striking the iron railing beside him. "Just so. The murderer, Watson, was the one who made Sir Alistair expect his punishment. He prepared the mind before the blade struck. When Reen entered the room, the victim was already half dead with terror. The wound itself was almost perfunctory, tidy, deliberate, the work of someone calm enough to stand behind the curtain and strike when the moment suited." "But the room was locked," I protested. "There was no trace of such a presence." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Locked from within, yes, but the French doors bore a crack, remember, a small fissure low in the pane." I measured it in the lantern light and found a minute mark of oil along the edge. That was no damage from outside, it was made from within. A thread of wire passed through to draw the bolt. The murderer was left unseen by that very route before Lestrade arrived. Clever. Too clever for the zealot Daly. The wind rose, carrying with it a thin whistle from the river barges. Holmes looked up sharply, his mind already racing ahead. "We must return at once." I left the study unsearched while Lestrade concerned himself with arrests. If the truth lies anywhere, it lies among Sir Alistair's private papers, and perhaps that missing letter was not destroyed at all. Within minutes we were again within the villa. The constable at the door saluted as Holmes brushed past him and ascended the stair 2 at a time. The study door creaked softly open, releasing the faint scent of ink and burnt paper. Holmes struck a match, lit the lamp, and began examining the desk with swift precision. The grate still held grey ash. Holmes stooped, sifting it delicately through, his fingers until a faint glimmer caught the light. "Ha! Not all burned," he murmured. "Look, wax seal remnants, green like the one upon Daly's letter, but impressed with a different stamp. A serpent biting its tail. Curious. And here, ink impressions on the blotter. The words barely visible, but legible enough. Cannot be silent longer, your treachery will find you, signed E." He straightened, his expression triumphant, yet grave. "Watson, Daly's scheme was no more than a spark. But this letter, this unseen writer, was the tinder, the one who signed with an initial only. I begin to see the pattern now, though I pray I am wrong." He turned to me, eyes alight with that fierce brilliance I had seen only when some new revelation pierced the murk. There is one person who had both motive and means to enter this house unseen, who knew Sir Alister's schedule and the secrets he carried home from Ireland. One who spoke little, observed much, and feared enough to act when fear became unbearable. "Whom do you mean, Holmes?" I asked, my voice low. He looked past me toward the door, where the faint sound of a footstep descended from the corridor above. "Hush, Watson," he whispered. "The answer comes to us now, unbidden." The handle turned, and in the lamplight stood Ellen Murphy, pale and trembling, her eyes no longer fearful, but strangely resolute. Ellen stood in the doorway, her hands clasped tightly before her, as though she feared they might betray her resolve. The lamplight flickered over her pale face, casting sharp shadows beneath her eyes. Holmes regarded her in silence for a long moment, his lean figure half turned toward the desk, the half-burned letter still between his fingers. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, almost gentle, yet each word fell with the precision of a blade. "You should have waited until morning, Miss Murphy. Confession is easier when daylight allows one to mistake shame for courage." Her lips parted, and a tremor passed through her. "You know, then?" "I know enough," Holmes replied quietly. "But I would prefer to hear it from you." She took one hesitant step into the room, her eyes darting toward the hearth, where the ash of the first letter still glimmered faintly. "I never meant for him to die, Mr. Holmes. I wanted only that he should suffer as others had. Sir Alister ruined my brother. He was a constable in Dublin, young, proud, foolish enough to believe in justice. When he refused to help falsify an arrest, Sir Alister had him dismissed and branded a traitor. My brother took his own life." Her voice caught, but she forced herself on. "When Mr. Daly found me, he already knew the story. He spoke of revenge, of truth. I thought he sought justice for Ireland, but all the while he wanted his own kind of triumph." Holmes watched her intently, his expression unreadable. "And so you became his agent within this house?" She nodded, faintly. "At first. But when I saw what he planned, I tried to stop him. I sent that first letter myself before he came. I thought if Sir Alister believed his guilt was discovered, he might confess, or flee, or anything but face him." She pressed her hands against her temples, but the fear only made him hide himself more. And when Mr. Daly's plan began, I was already too deep to withdraw. Holmes moved closer, his tone low but firm. "You entered the drawing room before the murder." "Yes," she whispered. "I brought the lantern from the scullery when I heard the tap upon the glass. But it wasn't Daly's signal, it was Reen's. I didn't know he'd come." I opened the door, left the lantern on the table, and went to fetch Mr. Daly at the lane. When I returned, Sir Alister was on the floor. She covered her face with her hands. There was so much blood, and the window was still locked. I thought the devil himself had done it. Holmes laid the charred letter upon the desk and regarded her with quiet gravity. "No, Miss Murphy, the devil had no part in it. You locked the window after Reen fled without knowing it. You thought you were sealing away guilt, but in truth you sealed the illusion of impossibility." Her head lifted sharply. "Then I am the cause." "The cause, perhaps, but not the murderer," Holmes said gently. "Reen struck the blow, Daly conceived the stage, you unwittingly drew the curtain. Yet the chain began long before you, forged by corruption and pride. The law will see mercy where I cannot." She looked at him with a kind of desperate gratitude, though tears stood in her eyes. "You will tell them, tell Inspector Lestrade." "I shall tell him the truth," Holmes said simply, "and the truth is not kind, but it need not be cruel." For a moment she swayed, her composure faltering, and Holmes guided her to the chair beside the hearth. I saw his hand linger upon her shoulder, neither reproach nor comfort, but something quiet and human that few ever glimpsed in him. When she had gone with the constable, Holmes turned to me, and the silence of the room pressed close once more. The lantern upon the desk grinned faintly through its carved slits, the candle within guttering low. He studied it for a long while before speaking. "You see, Watson, the tragedy of this affair lies not in its violence, but in its order. Each step was reasoned, deliberate, justice warped into spectacle, grief twisted into strategy. Daly believed himself righteous, Reen believed himself brave, and this poor girl believed herself merciful. Yet all were merely instruments of a greater vanity, the belief that vengeance can correct what conscience has neglected." He took the letter fragment from the desk, turning it once more in the lamplight. "Observe the serpent biting its tail, the oldest emblem of endless retribution. Sir Alister's seal, used by his victim. The cycle is complete." The fire hissed as it settled into embers. Holmes stood motionless, the shadows drawing long across the walls. "The law will close its ledger on this case," he said at last, "but the balance remains unsettled. Guilt is never singular. It clings like smoke to all who breathe the same air." As we left the house, dawn was breaking faintly over the Thames, washing the fog into pale silver. The street was quiet, save for the creak of a milkman's cart and the distant cry of a newsboy. Holmes paused once more at the gate, glancing back at the shuttered windows. "Another house purged by firelight," he murmured. "And yet, even now, somewhere in London, another candle burns for folly." He turned to me then, his gaze weary but steady. "Come, Watson, the game is done, and I confess I am tired of games." The morning swallowed his words as we walked into the thinning mist, leaving behind the house where vengeance had worn a smiling face, and where, for one haunted night, the jack-o'-lantern's grin had burned in mockery of justice itself. The fog had begun to lift by the time we reached Baker Street, thinning into threads of pale gold that curled about the chimneys and caught the first light of morning. Holmes spoke little on the drive back, though I could sense that his mind was far from rest. His gaze followed the shifting mist outside as though it still concealed unseen figures, shadows of those whose fates he had only just untangled. The cab wheels clattered rhythmically against the cobblestones, and I fancied I heard within that sound the echo of the lantern's hollow laughter, fading into distance but not yet extinguished. When at last we returned to our rooms, Holmes went immediately to the hearth. He cast his hat and coat aside, took up the poker, and stirred the embers into reluctant life. The faint warmth that spread through the sitting room did little to soften the weariness that had settled upon him. For a long while he stood thus, his back turned to me, until at length he spoke, quietly, almost to himself. "You observe, Watson, how every web of deceit reveals in the end its own architect. Daly wove his plan with cunning and conviction, but it was never strong enough to hold the weight of truth. Had he succeeded, Sir Alister's guilt might have been buried with him, and the illusion of justice served, but what emerged instead was far more human and far more tragic." He turned, his eyes dimmed with reflection rather,